Hello and welcome back to the Basic Bible Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Thompson, and I am coming to you right now from Arthur, Illinois, or otherwise known as the middle of nowhere. Actually, it's about 30 minutes from Decatur, if you're familiar with Illinois. It's a long way from home for me. This is literally horse and buggy country. There's a lot of Amish in this area, and I'm seeing horses and buggies everywhere, and it's killing me that I'm not on one yet. But what am I doing here? I'm at a soccer tournament. I'm at the ACSI Mid-America High School Soccer Tournament here with my son. And so at this tournament, I'm thinking about sports, which is not a subject I spend a lot of time thinking about, to be honest. But as I'm here, I'm thinking about an interview I did a little while back with Ted Kluck. If you know Ted, he's been a guest on this podcast before. Author of several books, which we're going to talk about on the other side of this, including books about sports. He is a sports writer. He's a teacher as well at a Christian college, a journalism professor, and author, a podcaster himself. If you listen to the Gut Check podcast or the Happy Rant podcast, you'll know who Ted Kluck is. But during COVID at our school, we had to do a virtual chapel, several virtual chapels, and Ted was nice enough to join us for one, but he didn't want to actually speak through the computer, but we had a conversation, we had an interview, and we talked about sports and how Christians should approach sports. And so I thought, yeah, you know what, I didn't really have anything planned for the podcast this week. As we're heading into November, we're going to take a break from the podcast. That's going to be no podcast November. And so I'm looking up to that. Next week, we are going to air our special Pastor Appreciation podcast, but I was trying to figure out what I'd like to do this week, and I knew I'd be busy. I'm down here with the tournament. Actually, I've been promoted to assistant coach of the team. Yes, you heard that right. I am the assistant coach of the Rock County Christian School Eagle soccer team, and that basically involves getting snacks for the head coach and making sure I don't pay the admission fee as a spectator. Anyway, I've been driving with a group of teenagers. That's been interesting. But I was able to give a devotion this morning to the team, and that was pretty exciting. I like doing things like that. So I'm at the soccer tournament, so I'm thinking about sports, and so I wanted to air this interview I did with Ted Kluck about Christians and sports. I think it'll help you. I think it'll bless you, especially if you are a sports guy or gal yourself. I think it'll be good. So this was a chapel for high school students, so you'll hear that reference from time to time. But I think it's a good interview, and I'd like to share it with you. Ted Kluck is always a fascinating guy to talk to, so you're not going to want to miss this. So without any further ado, here's my interview with Mr. Ted Kluck. And our guest this week is author and professor Ted Kluck. Ted, welcome.
Kevin, great to be here, man. This is fun.
I've got a pile of your books here, and we're going to be talking about sports. But I want to talk about some of your other books real quick, just to introduce you guys. One of my favorites, Re-Rapture. I
love it.
If you're into end times, this is a book for you, and it's hilarious. It saved my life. Mrs. Mason, if you're listening, this is how I got through one of our speech meets a couple of years ago.
Good old Mrs. Mason. That's sweet of her to be okay with that.
So, yes, I read this through instead of listening to the puppet shows as I was supposed to. And then, you've written a number of books. Some of them we're going to talk about. But I wanted to mention these two real quick. The Extraordinary Life of a Mediocre Jock, which is kind of written for teenage below, somewhere around that area, right?
Yep. Yeah, like middle school age kids, I think.
Yeah. So we have a number of middle school students listening to this. And I know this comes Tony Thompson approved. Tony's read this. In fact, Tony is here in the building somewhere, but sorry, he chose lunch over you.
Oh, man, that hurts.
I got
Ouch.
He wanted to be with his friends. More recently, and Tony's reading this one, The Outstanding Life of an Awkward Theater Kid. These are good books. I haven't read them personally, but I'm told from Tony. So shout out to Tony. And Tony, I'm hoping you are thoroughly embarrassed now that I've mentioned your name in front of all your friends. But so Ted, we're going to talk about sports, and you're a sports guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Lifelong.
You've written you've written on the topic. You've written for ESPN.com. You've written books on Mike Tyson and almost a book with Tim Tebow.
Yeah, we got real close, but didn't quite make it. I would have been rich beyond our wildest dreams. I'd be doing this interview from a yacht if that had happened.
Well, you wouldn't be doing this interview. Let's be honest. If that is.
Well, no, don't talk like that, man.
All right. Well, I got to ask you this question real quick. I'm a Massachusetts guy, born and raised, and so I got to ask you, your book, Facing Tyson. How intimidating was it to be in the presence of the one Hurricane Peter McNeely?
You know what? I never actually talked to Peter McNeely in person. We talked on the phone. The great Peter McNeely, of course, the first fight for Mike Tyson after he got out of prison. And another Massachusetts guy, though, who I had a really enjoyable interview with was the great Kevin McBride. Who knocked out Mike Tyson in Mike's last fight. So had a blast with Kevin McBride. I flew into Boston during a blizzard. So somehow our flight got there and drove like the 4 miles to the airport hotel. It took like an hour and a half, and had a great meeting with Kevin McBride. It was a blast.
Awesome. All right, so let's jump into our topic here. The idea of sports and faith. Sometimes we don't think about molding those two together, or if we try to, it doesn't really fit. I mean, do we have to be the Tim Tebow and put the John 3:16 under the eyes, or we have to kneel after every touchdown or stuff? So could you talk just a general question of how do you incorporate your faith on the playing field?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a lifelong challenge for me to figure that very thing out, Kevin, in the sense that, so I'm showing my age here, but I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. So I grew up in the decade of like terrible sports theology, in that we thought that if we were good kids who like knelt in the end zone and Sharpied a cross on our wrist tape, that God would bless us by making all of our dreams come true. And sadly, that didn't, and providentially, that didn't happen for me. But it created in me a desire to really understand why God put me here, right? So if I wasn't here to live all my athletic dreams and quote unquote glorify God by, pointing at the sky after I scored a touchdown, what was I here for? And, learning that, and, learning what Christ really did for me and what he requires of me has been at times difficult and sanctifying, but at more times joyful and freeing. And it's been the greatest thing of my life. I mean, far greater than anything that could have happened to me as an athlete. So I think my arc was really finding my way out of the desert of that bad theology as a kid, learning to come to terms with what the Lord has allowed me to do as an athlete, as a coach, but then writing about it and sharing about that through some of these books that I've written on my own and some of the books that I've written with other people about sports. It's been a lifelong source of fascination. And I think sports can both reveal character and build character. So I think that's why I keep going back there.
Well, when it comes to life on the field, let me ask you this. You've got 2 kids and they're active in sports. And what do you teach them when it comes to how to handle themselves?
Don't be like your dad, basically. But
that's the same message I give to my kids.
Yeah, there you go, man. I think we're safe there. But no, in every way, Kevin, sports brings out both the best and the worst in me. I mean, I'm a dog when I'm competing, and sometimes I come home and I feel guilty for things that I've said, things that I've thought. I have to apologize to my kids frequently about it, and it's actually provided a way into some really exceptional gospel conversations with my kids when I come home from a game that I've coached or played in and had to say, hey man, I really feel convicted about what I said, or about what I said about the other coach or one of your teammates. And those are raw moments, but I think they're moments in a family where we can really see the gospel at work. Yeah. And if my kids see me broken, that's one of the key elements of the gospel, right? If they see that dad has a repentant heart, dad feels guilt, his heart is soft, and they see me cry out to my Redeemer for forgiveness and cry out to them for reconciliation, then I think we're doing something, even though we haven't maybe handled the situation perfectly. And I think we keep going back to sports, my kids and I. As fans, we want to see the transcendent moment, right? We want to see the great performance. And as athletes, for me, I'm always chasing the perfect performance, right? or as a coach, I'm always chasing, the perfect game, the perfect play. And we always fall short of that. So it always provides a moment where our own desires kind of bump up against the reality of life in a broken world. So a lot of chances to talk about God's grace in that equation.
When it comes to, we try to glorify God in all that we do, and we can incorporate that here. One of the things I try to teach my students is that part of glorifying God is not just literal praise and worship with music and with Bibles or whatnot, but God has given each person different talents and different abilities. And as part of, back in Genesis 3, Genesis 1, this dominion mandate of taking the talents and abilities God's given you and using that and cultivating those gifts, that in itself is an act of worship. It takes talent to, whether it's throwing a ball in a hoop, trying to navigate your way through a field to score a touchdown. All of those things are taking talents and abilities that not everybody has, and using them in a way that shows that you care about what God, those talents that God given you. You're cultivating that gift.
Yeah, that's right. I think, man, one of the trickiest things in my life has been I'd never really understood what glorifying God meant.
Yeah.
And it was one of these phrases that was bandied about by Christian athletes when I was young, and glorifying God in that context always meant doing really well. And as I got older, and we all hit a ceiling in terms of our athletic ability, right? So as I got into college and beyond, and I started to run up against, guys that were better than me, and I started to get hurt, and I started to have dreams die athletically. I really had no idea what it meant to glorify God. And I really dove into that. And by God's grace, he showed me that the way I treat people, the way I treat my teammates, the way I treat my kids now, the way I treat my opponents even, can be glorifying in a sports context, even if I'm not the guy who's on the mountaintop, doing the winning thing. And that's been great, right? Because as a Christian, and I think just as a person, right? So we're all created with a sin nature. We all have total depravity in our hearts, but we're also counterbalanced with that is the idea that we're all created in God's image, right? So for me, leaning hard into that second part and realizing that even if my play isn't perfect, even if I run up against people who are better than me, God can still be glorified in this, and he can even be glorified in my losses. He can be glorified in my injuries. And it really creates an interesting dynamic in that I began to realize that the things that were happening to me weren't arbitrary. And in fact, they were ordained by a God who had my good and his glory in mind, such that even though I was losing and even though stuff wasn't going the way I wanted it to go, and we could lay this pathology over academics or theater or debate or anything that we're winning or losing at, I started to realize that it wasn't just happening to me. It wasn't just arbitrary. And in fact, God had a plan, and at some level that took the sting out of losing a little bit. It's still tough for me, right? But knowing that he has me on this journey of becoming remade in his image day by day and year by year, it helps sports to feel like they matter a little bit more.
Well, let's talk about the opposite of that. Now, you can tell just by looking at me, I'm a stellar athlete.
Oh, dude, you're a thoroughbred.
Kind of went pro, but and students, someday I'll share with you my my high school basketball story. The only time I set a record on my high school basketball team.
So Kevin, you were a point guard or a two? What are we looking at?
It's hard to say because I only played 9/10 of a second.
Okay.
That was my record, the least amount of time played in the game.
Solid.
But anyway, so what about that mountaintop experience? Let's say, maybe we've got students and people who really are that good. And you do have the game winning home run. You've got the last second touchdown, whatever. And maybe you're, one of those rare people that, maybe you're on a trajectory that, maybe not pro, but maybe you're going to play college ball or something. You're really that good. Yeah. How do you keep pride from creeping in during those moments?
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely as parents, we can pray for that for our kids. Right. Yeah. And we do. I think just realizing in those moments that as fun as they are, and the Lord allowed me to have some of those in high school and beyond, but as fun as they are, there's still an emptiness there where you realize that if I'm taking all the glory, then my teammates aren't getting it. God isn't getting it. And I think realizing that the condition of my heart is more important than the condition of my body, and or the condition of my recruitment or my Twitter feed or how many letters that I'm getting from colleges, those things began to feel a bit empty at the end of the day when I looked at who I really was in light of, my perfect creator Lord. And I think that conviction, it can only come from the Spirit. And, if we know Christ, we can pray for that conviction to happen in our own hearts so that we orient things correctly. And if we don't know Christ, he can still use those circumstances that we run up against in sports to teach us those things. I'm reminded of, so you're a Massachusetts guy. Are you a Pats fan then, Kevin?
Oh, of course.
Me too, man. I'm a huge Pats guy. It's
you
because
might have just lost a lot of friends among our student body here.
I know, dude, that's very polarizing, and in fact, even in Christendom, there are a lot of people that think like you can't be a Christian and a Pats fan, but you and I are living proof. Right? Yeah, we're living proof that you can be. But even our golden boy of a quarterback for those years, Tom Brady. I remember one Super Bowl, and you've heard this anecdote, but he shared in an authentic moment, like feeling like, is this all there is? I'd been to that mountaintop. He's there on the podium receiving the trophy and getting littered with confetti, but yet there was a feeling of emptiness. And I think that's emblematic of our lives. And again, this pathology is not unique to sports. After you attain that relationship that you've always wanted, right? You get the boyfriend or the girlfriend that you've always wanted, and there's still a feeling of, I'm not okay yet. For me, it was publishing after sports ended, after football ended. Feeling like getting a first book deal would be this transcendent moment, or getting published by ESPN, or getting a movie made, or whatever. These are not transcendent moments. And in fact, I find that the most transcendent moments are the ones where I feel the most dependent on Christ and, being convicted of sin, being shown my Redeemer, being pardoned, being reminded of my pardon. These are the transcendent moments in life, right? And we can still enjoy sports, but I think we learn as we're more refined to keep them in their proper place.
Now, you did give me an excuse there to show my students my YouTube clip of my 15 seconds of fame when Tom Brady was asked about me for just a brief second. I ran for office years ago in Massachusetts, and I learned a difficult lesson. You never criticize Tom Brady if you're running for office. That's the only time I made national news or any news at all ever.
Dude, tell me about that. Can we go like 2 minutes on that? You criticized Tommy?
Yeah. So this was 2007.
Okay.
And Brady had just broken up with his supermodel girlfriend, and then started up another relationship with his current wife. But his ex-girlfriend, I can't remember her name now, had just released the fact that she was pregnant and having his child. And me, of course, being the awesome Christian guy that I am, had to make a comment on my blog and saying basically he was acting like a teenager, and people need to take responsibility for their child. I didn't even know what I was talking about back then.
Dude, shout out blogs too, man. That's a thing of the early 2000s.
But this was like a third-party candidacy. It was never going to go anywhere. But all of a sudden, I was also a pastor at the time, assistant pastor, and that night at church, somebody came, Pastor Thompson, there's a news crew outside that wants to talk to you. And all of a sudden, I started getting attention. And Fox Sports had asked Brady about it. I think he said like no comment or something, but for a brief second, Tom Brady knew my name. So,
dude, you existed in Tom Brady's world for a brief second. That's exciting.
That's the only time ever that will happen. Oh well. So I'll play that YouTube clip for you guys later. All right, so I'm going to get to questions from the students. They submit some questions here. And first one here, is it ever okay to skip church for a game for sports?
Dude, your student's going for the jugular there, man. That's getting into some tough stuff right away. I would say, man, I'm not in the business of making law, right? So I never want to be the Christian author, the Christian speaker who's laying a bunch of law on people. But I'll say this. I know that commitment and involvement in the local church has been one of the most joyful things of my life, both on the level of richness of relationships and also on the level of conviction of sin, and again, seeing my Redeemer. You know, those things for me happen at church because I'm able to stand in a room and praise with my friends, right? Which is amazing. And which, as a kind of quote unquote tough guy, fake athlete like myself, like I was never a guy who was comfortable like standing in a room and singing in front of other people. But now, like, by God's grace, because of the softening and humbling he's done in my heart, I look forward to that, man. Every week. I love it. And I know that a lot of people, especially young athletes and parents of young athletes, they get intoxicated by this idea that I've got to join every travel league and travel team, and my kid's going to get a college scholarship or go to the pros. And as a result, they just dip out of church for like months at a time because they're chasing around, you know, doing these sports. And I will say, from the perspective of both a college coach and also a college and after athlete, if you're good, they will find you. And if you have the attributes and the talent that it takes to pop off, you probably don't need to be in 25 travel leagues, you know, dipping out of church for months at a time. So I would experiment with making that commitment to the local church and not giving up on sports, not giving up on athletics, but maybe we don't have to join this rat race of all the travel and all the craziness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me ask you this question. I thought this was a really good question. Where is the line between game intensity and disrespect when it comes to heat with another team?
Oh man, that's such a great one. Your students are amazing, by the way. These are hard questions. I would say that I am Mr. Game Intensity to the degree that I often come home feeling guilty. So, remembering that my opponent is created in God's image, and remembering that the things that do or don't come out of my mouth during a game are reflections of my relationship with Christ. Man, I tell you, I've had to ask forgiveness from people I played against. Like, I've gone up to people or reached out to people after games and said, dude, that thing I said in the fourth quarter, I'm really sorry. I don't want that to be who I am. And man, those are pride swallowing moments, right? So I think praying for a soft heart and a soft conscience and letting that kind of drive how we act during a game, it's just a good rule of thumb. And it's one that I'll be the first to admit I don't always live up to it, but I want to.
All right, so we are right here in the midst of Packer country. Diehard Packer fans. If you were to step into our old administrator's office, it would have been like a shrine to Lambeau Field. So this question is, how do you passionately follow a team but not let it become an idol?
Yeah. So that's one of the things I don't struggle with. Like, I don't passionately follow a team. I love the Pats, and, you know, there are a couple other teams I enjoy watching, but I'm not the guy that gets like super emotional if they lose. I think, though, I will say a couple of my greatest football experiences took place in Wisconsin. When I became a freshman in high school, my parents started sending me to the Barry Alvarez University of Wisconsin football camp. And I went to it in high school because it was the only padded camp in the Midwest. Like, it was the only camp where you could, you know, put pads on and smash into people. So I have fond memories of Camp Randall Stadium and Wisconsin football. Took a tour of the Packer Hall of Fame on one of those trips, and absolutely loved it. Got a tour of Lambeau. I mean, those are football shrines, right? And they are, like, in the fall, like a central part of our life where, you know, if you're a kid in Wisconsin, you're probably going to church and looking at your watch and you can't wait to get home and watch the Packers. So I think what Tim Keller has said and written about idolatries of the heart, right? Taking a good thing and not letting it become an ultimate thing, and asking yourself, if this thing was gone, could I still worship, right? Could I still, if God took it away, could I still love God? Could I love a God who took away Packer football, or who made the Packers terrible for a decade, which they were between Vince Lombardi and the Brett Favre era. They were pretty terrible for more than a decade. So could I still love? Could I still worship? Could I still be okay with a God who takes those things away and takes them out of my life for a time? And I think that's a good way to check our own hearts.
Okay, talking about going for the jugular, politics in sports. I mean,
Oh.
you can't avoid the topic now.
Yeah.
It's either, especially if we're watching the basketball playoffs right now, Black Lives Matter all over. Even again, NFL, the controversy with the national anthem. So, as a Christian, how do we approach these things? Is the question.
Yeah. So, my involvement with politics and sports has always been relational, and it's always been, to me, about hospitality. So I coach in non-COVID seasons. I'm an assistant football coach at a historically Black college, Lane College, where I'm the only white dude in the program usually. And for me, that's all about relationships. It's all about hospitality. And, at no point, if I don't kneel during the national anthem, are any of my players looking at me going, Kluck must hate us or not care about us, because they know me, right? They know my heart. They know that I love them and my home is open to them, and we've shared stuff together, right? We've shared life. And I think one of the triumphs of sports when it's working well is that it actually provides a respite from a lot of that hatefulness that we see in society and that we see in social media, because it is intensely relational. So even the fan experience, right? So if you go to Lambeau Field, Kevin, you might be shoulder to shoulder for 3 hours with, an African-American guy with totally different politics, or a suburban guy with totally different politics, or whatever. And for that 3 hours, you're united in your love for the Packers. And I think that's what can be joyful about sports. And it's what can be a release from a lot of, what we see in the culture. The tricky thing about right now is that we're having that stuff kind of foisted upon us in a space that's historically been off limits to politics. And if you're like me and politics fills you with existential despair, this is a hard moment for you. Now, you ran for office, so you may feel differently.
See, I follow politics more than I follow sports. So
really, oh my gosh, how do you keep from being filled with despair? This is a real question, asking for myself.
Honestly, because I believe in the sovereignty of God.
Okay.
Because I believe God's in control, and no matter who wins political office, I'm confident, the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and he'll turn it however he wants to in the book of Psalms. That's what keeps me sane. But that's just how I was raised. I follow political races like you'd follow a pennant race. It's just, to me, that's my thing. But
fascinating. Now, if your candidate loses, how have you dealt with that historically? And has it been a hard moment for you in your heart in terms of placing your hope somewhere?
So I grew up in Boston, or just south of Boston. So I was a Red Sox fan. So we always had that phrase of, well, let's just wait till next year.
Yeah, sure.
Up until, was it 2004 when they finally, because I 1980s, 1990s is when I was following them. So that's just been my attitude. And right now I don't even have a horse in the race. So it's a little easier to take a step back.
For sure.
All right, so I want to ask another question about changing topics a little bit. I got a couple of questions about publishing and about writing. So being a published author, you've written in several genres, whether it's sports or theology, or again, just even satire, or cigars even. What advice do you have to some young aspiring writers here in high school?
Yeah, man, just read a lot and write a lot and work on your craft. That's what all writing teachers say. But, for me, my path into writing was so non-traditional in that I did go to college on a football scholarship. I had no interest in academics, no interest in really even going to class or being bothered by any of that. And then my sophomore year, I had a re-injury. I'd broken the same leg twice and had to go in for a big operation and tried to come back, fall ball my sophomore year. And I just couldn't move. I couldn't run. I was full of pain. I couldn't play the way I wanted to play. And the Lord took football away for a while, which, as I look back, was really embittering and hard in the moment, but really merciful in the long term, because it allowed me to not only taste and see that God could be good in the midst of a broken dream, but also it opened my eyes to other things that I could do and other personas that I could potentially have. And into that glum 90s existential moment stepped a really hot little theater girl. Her name was Kristen, and Kristen was very literate, and she loved to write and read. And I've been married to her for 24 years now, which is God's grace to me. But she encouraged me to write. She read some of the stuff that I read or that I had written in school, and she was like, "You're really good at this, and you don't even try. So you should try." So that was day one of me becoming a writer. So I found that I really loved it. I found that writing and telling my own story, telling other people's stories was really joyful for me. So I kind of approached it in the way that I approached football, which was to go all in and just be a savage in terms of my work ethic and how much I was reading, how much I was writing, pursuing opportunities, getting knocked down some, getting told no. You know, I don't have thick skin. Writing teachers always say that you should have thick skin. I have the thinnest skin. If you hold me up to the light, you could see through me. That's how thin my skin is as it pertains to writing. But I think what football did teach me was, if I lose, if I get knocked down, I got to get back on the horse right away and keep going and keep moving. And that's been good for me. That's been a blessing in my writing career, because sometimes you will get told no, and it's not a referendum on your future or the rest of your career as a writer. But I would say find authors that you love to read and read all their work, practice a bunch, seek opportunities to get published, and see what happens. Because my way into it was as non-traditional as you could imagine.
All right, one final question before I let you go.
Sure.
We also have two young aspiring podcasters here listening, and we can listen to you on the Happy Rant podcast and the Gut Check podcast, and you've taught classes on podcasting. Any advice for these guys?
Yeah, so podcasting is interesting in that people listen for one of two reasons. You listen to a podcast primarily because either one, you want information, right? So right now, because I hate myself and I'm a glutton for punishment, I listen to a lot of fantasy football podcasts, because even though I hate playing fantasy football, I still do it. So I'm listening to those for the information, right? I'm listening for like who I should trade for, who I should get off the waiver wire or whatever. The other reason you listen to a podcast, though, is because you love being with the hosts, right? So what I tell students is decide which kind of show you're going to have. The Happy Rant is a good example of a show where people, I think, just enjoy being with us. So we've been doing that show now for 7 or 8 years. It's 3 of us. We're all good friends in real life, and we just like being together, and we like doing the show. The show is fun. Even though we have a lot of listeners now, we did it for a while back when we had very few listeners, and it was still joyful. So if you really enjoy the people and you're able to create a world that the listener likes, then podcasting is great, because it's very low investment, right? You can do it for free. You can do it for the laptop that you already probably have. You can record on it. You can put out product. You can keep refining and keep working on the craft of doing a good show, and then kind of let the platform piece fall into place.
Well, thank you for listening to that interview with Ted Kluck. I hope that was a blessing to you as it was to me and the students at Rock County Christian. And speaking of the students at Rock County Christian, update on my career as an assistant coach and the ACSI Midwestern High School Soccer Tournament, the Rock County Christian School Eagles. Well, we didn't do so well. We won our first game, but kind of went downhill after that. So I don't know if that was my fault as an assistant coach, but here we are. Oh well. But I do want to recommend you check out some of these books by Ted Kluck. Some of the books that we've mentioned here. The Reason for Sports, a Christian Manifesto. It's a great little book by Ted. A book that we've actually talked with Ted about before, and my son Tony has read. The Extraordinary Life of a Mediocre Jock. God, I'll do anything. You want to read that? That's more of a graphic novel for kids right around preteen, early teens. My son loved it. I think you will as well. Other books by Ted. We talked about his book on adoption on a previous episode. Hello, I Love You, Adventures in Adoptive Fatherhood, which is just a great book. You want to read that. Also, we've got his latest book, which is a collection of essays. I've read this. It's great. A Hard Thing on a Beautiful Day and other essays. You can read his other books as well. You can go through and read his books on football, or Facing Tyson is an interesting book. Also his book with Ronnie Martin, The Bridezilla of Christ. These are all books that I've bought and that I've enjoyed. But anyway, all right, so we want to wrap this up and join us back next week. Next week will be, if everything goes according to plan, will be our special Pastor Appreciation Month episode. And then after that, we're going through no podcast November. So I'm taking the month of November off. Going to do a little more recording during that time, but also just a time just to take a little bit of a break from the podcast. All right. Well, until next week, have a great rest of your week.